Hi friends, welcome back to ARC Tutorials. This is AWS Services Concept Series. My goal of this series is to make you understand and get you knowledgeable enough about all the services that AWS has to offer and what each of those services do and what we can utilize out of it. Like I said, this is a concept series to make you understand about the services. Make sure that you follow this channel to learn all the AWS services with me. Today we are learning about AWS Lambda. This is part 2 of the series. Earlier I had covered EC2. Make sure that you go through that as well. Alright, let's talk about AWS Lambda in short. AWS Lambda is a serverless computing service provided by AWS that allows to run code without provisioning or managing servers. What this means? It means that when you create your functions or when you write your code, you don't need to have a server. You don't need to buy a server. You don't need to rent a server. Instead, you can use AWS Lambda as a service and you can directly push your code and run that API or backend code or whatever code you have. This is extremely powerful because it you don't have to really sit down, start the server, stop the server, scale the server, down the server. No, everything is automatic and hence the word serverless. It automatically scales your application by running code in response to triggers and events. Yet another very powerful feature, because you will say whenever user triggers a email, whenever some email attachment is done, let's say whenever user deletes a particular record, whenever user sends a message, etc, etc, any actions basically can trigger and you can invoke an endpoint. That's the most powerful thing about AWS Lambda or any serverless configuration. AWS Lambda enables developers to build scalable and cost-effective applications without managing servers. Also, since it's part of the AWS platform, you can easily trigger into other AWS services like say S3 bucket or RDS or database or event driven or say email or storage, whatever. Alright, let's talk in detail about AWS Lambda. Now, like I mentioned, AWS Lambda is a serverless computing, which means the code will run without you managing the servers. Think of it that AWS will manage the servers for you. So all you have to do is focus on running your code, making sure that the application of your logic of your application is correct. Event driven, like I mentioned, this is very powerful because you can basically trigger based on the events that we want to configure. When user uploads, when user deletes, when user creates, or when an email inbox, when you receive an inbox, when a file is uploaded, any such event you can trigger the serverless API or the endpoints. Automatic scaling, I talked to you about this. You don't have to worry about scaling your application or code. It would automatically be managed. Pay as you go pricing, this is beautiful because you only pay for the compute time consumed by your code, right? Integration, which means I told you about, you can integrate easily with DynamoDB, Amazon S3, API gateway, or say SMS service, or say storage or RDS in any AWS service. Execution environment. Now, if you want your language to be supported, serverless can handle that. Be it PHP, Node.js, Python, Java, JavaScript, anything, it can handle it. Versioning and alias, which means you can manage multiple versions of your functions and create aliases for seamless updates. Easily manage your multiple services rather than think of them as functions which are just running. You can create multiple versions of the same copies and run them in different modes. I talked to you about some of the features already, like event sources. You can customize for SNS, queuing service, API gateway, DynamoDB, S3, RDS, anything. You can also configure and use AWS CloudWatch to see the logging and monitoring. By default, it comes with IAM roles and groups and policies, which means it's secured. You can pre-configure and pass the configuration variables to your functions. That is what we call them as environment variables. Stateless executions, all the functions are by default stateless, which means the moment you send a request and it returns a response, the transaction ends there. Nothing is stored unless you are interacting with a DB or an RDS. You can easily use third-party extensions to make your Lambda functions more powerful. Now let's talk about some of the pros. Obviously, it's a serverless architecture, which means your headache of managing a server is gone. It automatically scales based on the incoming request volume. It supports multiple programming languages, Node.js, TypeScript, Python, Go, you name it, it supports. Pay as you go, you only pay for the computing time, okay, and not the entire server that you run on. What are some of the cons? Now there are some cons or drawbacks, you can say, like limited execution duration and memory size for functions. Now you can't have a Lambda function running for 4 days, 5 days, right? So there is some time execution duration that you need to do. For such purposes, we have something called AWS batch. Now cold start latency. So now in sometimes infrequency can be observed in the functions. Again, that's very minor. Debugging and monitoring. Now debugging and monitoring, you can use AWS CloudWatch to debug and monitor, but there are other tools as well where you can configure in AWS and get that help of debug and monitoring. But again, the cons are pretty less and they weight very less compared to the pros. Some of the use cases: event driven processing, like I told you, when files are uploaded to S3, trigger; when something is queued, trigger; when an SMS is sent, trigger; when a record is created in database, create a trigger, and much more, right? So basically anything and everything about events can be handled by Lambda. Web and mobile backends. Now you can build powerful scalable backend services for web as well as mobile applications. Real-time file processing. Now let's say your application is something that needs to send, say you are building an online chat or a real-time tool which needs to send files, etc. You can easily use AWS Lambda. It can even handle large amount of data processing through IoTs in real time for analytics and reporting and much more. These are only few use cases, but like I said, you can use AWS Lambda for literally all backend or API work. Some of the real world examples: Netflix uses Lambda for transcoding media files. Airbnb uses user generated content uploads like images, reviews, and trigger notifications using Lambda functions. Capital One uses Lambda for real time fraud detection. Nordstorm implements serverless microservices architecture for e-commerce applications. These are some of the real world examples that you should be aware of. Alright, that's all about AWS Lambda as a service overview and introduction that you should know. In the next episode, I will cover about Amazon ECS. Do not get confused with EC2 that I have already covered. And that's precisely why I'm creating this series, so that you should be aware of all the services that are available in AWS, and you should know what they are capable of. You should know where and why to use them. Thank you so much for joining in this episode. Let's continue, learn all the services, and then parallelly we will also start our hands-on AWS. Thank you so much for joining in this episode. I'll see you in the next episode.